even when things are, the whole place is falling apart, there are opportunities on South Africa's financial markets. And in fact, I am actually, as a rule, quite bullish on, especially on our bond market, not necessarily on equities, but the bond market really provides wonderful opportunities, sure, at least in the short term, for somebody like what I've said, to take a quick bite out of that.
Hello, my name is Donald Magashule, and yes, my father is innocent. You're watching the #1 media company, WorldView, where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today we're chatting again with a good friend of WorldView, Dawie Roodt. Dawie is the chief economist at the Efficient Group. He is also a 42nd generational spin doctor for the South African Communist Party. Dawie, welcome back to the show.
On that one, Donald, hello. Thank you very much.
So, Dawie, what is your key takeaways from the Minister of Finance medium-term budget policy statement? Is there anything significant that happened there?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. And I think there's a lot of good news in the statement as well. The first important part of the good news is certainly the state revenue, and I agree with the Minister. According to the Minister, state revenue will report an overrun in the region of about 120 billion rand. And that is mostly because of the commodity cycle, strong commodity cycle that we're currently experiencing. So he expects the overrun to be in the region of about 120 billion. I think it's going to be more. When I say overrun, I mean in comparison to the regional budgeted estimates. So, but I think it's a bit on the conservative side. I think the actual overrun will be in the region of about 150 billion or so. And that's mostly on company taxes, like I said, because of the commodity cycle. But quite interesting, just about all the major taxes are doing better than originally expected. And I think that is just a sign of an economy that's gradually coming out of the lockdown. And of course, that people are spending more money and all of that are filtering through by way of higher tax collections for the Minister of Finance. So that is certainly, as far as I'm concerned, the highlight. Then of this 120 billion, unfortunately, approximately 80 billion has already been spent. So that means a saving in the region of about 40 billion or so that the Minister is penciling in terms of a reduction in the borrowing that he's going to do. And the reduction in borrowing will be mostly on the short end, which means it will mostly be on treasury bills. And you will be borrowing less on treasury bills, but the longer term, on the longer end of the curve, you will keep on borrowing as previously planned to do. So that is there's some technicalities there. And then something that I noticed that I think is very important is the question about the extension of this temporary COVID grant. Now, there are something like 9 million people that qualified for this temporary COVID grant. And remember, there are already 19 odd million people receiving normal grants, the so-called child support grant and the old age grant and disability grant and so on. So there's an additional 9 million people now receiving this temporary COVID grant, and that will come to an end the end of March next year. Now, obviously, that's coming at a huge cost to the Minister of Finance, and he needs to somehow address that. And he addressed it in a typical political fashion, and that's simply passing the ball to Parliament and say, listen, I'm not going to make a decision about this. The grant will come to an end the end of March, and if there's any decision on this, it will be for Cabinet to decide upon. So Cabinet must decide on whether there will be some sort of extension on the special grant. Now, that is important for me for a number of reasons. One is that if you take away the grant, even though it is a temporary grant, if you take away the income of 9 million people, 9 million people are going to get angry at you. And also remember, there are 19 million people receiving the normal grants and 2 million civil servants, and they will be getting less as well, in real terms at least. So we're talking about 30 million people that can potentially get angry at you over the next a couple of years as the Minister of Finance is trying to stabilize the state finances. And that is happening 2 years before the next general election. Now, that is extremely difficult for a politician to do, to start cutting back on state spending just before a general election. So that's an interesting space that I will be looking out for to see how the Minister of Finance is going to square that circle and what Cabinet is going to decide next year as far as these so-called temporary grants are concerned. But those are the two things that I think are important. Of course, there are odds and ends and a couple of other things as well, but those are the two things that I really, and remember, this is it's not a budget in a normal sense of the word. This is just mostly a report back opportunity for the Minister of Finance and to report back on things like, for example, tax overruns and so on. But quite often what you can see and read between the lines is something that he's planning to do in next year's budget. But those are the two most important things.
Is it unorthodox for a Minister of Finance to pass the buck to the Parliament, as it were, to give them the responsibility to make a decision as important as this?
Well, it's not only the Minister of Finance that makes decisions as far as the budget is concerned. I mean, he's responsible for the budget, but it's always a matter of talking to the other ministers, and it's always and that's always a conflict, because the Minister of Finance has got limited resources, and the other ministers, they've got unlimited demands on the budget. So I think it's all, the idea behind this is that the Minister of Finance, it's supposed to be a consensus decision more or less. But in practice, what happens, it is basically the Minister of Finance that determines the size of the envelope, as they call it. So he will tell you, listen, this is what I have available. This is what I can give you. And if you want more, then, I mean, we have to take it away somewhere else. But this specific decision by the Minister of Finance to pass the buck, so to speak, to the rest of Cabinet, that I don't know, and I've been analyzing this for many, many decades now. I can't think of a previous situation where the Minister of Finance quite obviously is passing this very, very hot political potato to the other colleagues. Of course, the other colleagues are going to say, listen, the election is going to be around the corner. We have to get the money somewhere. Blah, blah, blah. And let's see how that's going to pan out. That's going to be quite interesting. And I did mention earlier that I think the total overrun is probably going to be in the region of about 150 billion or even more. So there could be an additional 30 billion or so available to the Minister of Finance. So I think the pressure on the Minister of Finance will be really huge pressure on the Minister of Finance to extend and to make this eventually a permanent kind of grant. In fact, what I think is going to happen is that I think there could be another kind of grant on the horizon, which will include all these sort of things. Let's call it the basic income grant, which may include maybe even more people than the current additional 9 million people. So who knows? But I think this space is ripe for some sort of overall. And there's, as you know, a lot of talk about the possibility of introducing some kind of basic income grant. And maybe, and I'm speculating here now, we had this super savings fund that was proposed by the Minister of Social Welfare, whatever it's called, whereby all the various pension funds will be combined into one super pension fund. Subsequently, she's withdrawn that, of course. And I've got a suspicion that there could be something else on the horizon, which will include something like a super pension fund for everybody, as well, with some sort of grant to everybody, a basic income grant, and that all of that coupled to the national health insurance. So I think there could be something on the horizon which will combine all these various factors of social security support.
No, definitely it will be interesting 2 years. Do you think the ANC or Ramaphosa specifically, they have the time to right the ship, as it were, to make the changes necessary for them to actually recuperate in 2024? Or is it already over?
Yeah, no, I think it's pretty much over. I think they do have the time. And I think if you have a strong leader, and I think Ramaphosa is quite a weak leader, we've spoken about this before, for various reasons. I think it's including his personality, but for other reasons as well. And I just don't think that he will be able to turn this around. I think the ANC is going to get below 50. The ANC is on a downward spiral. We've seen that. There is enough time to turn this around, but I just don't think that the current political leadership has it in them to turn it around, firstly. And secondly, I don't think they will be allowed to turn this around. Remember, the ANC and everything around that is one massive patronage. It's one huge criminal organization that is simply feeding off the state. And all of those people, and that includes everybody, politicians, people working for a state, people getting contracts from the state, everybody. There are so many people that will be affected if the president and, of course, the political leadership do want to make a difference here, that it's just not possible. I just can't see how they're going to do that. Because what you need to do, you have to cut back on spending on civil servants. They're going to get angry. You have to go and check at all these contracts. And people are going to get angry. We saw what happened to Eskom. People are sabotaging Eskom. That sort of thing will keep on happening if you really want to make a difference. And I just don't think they've got the stomach to do that.
Dawie, what do you think will happen? Okay, let's say the ANC falls below 50% in 2024. What do you think will happen in the financial markets in South Africa? Do you think there will be a similar situation what happened in the United States, where the Dow dropped dramatically when Trump won in 2016, and then it climbed, it skyrocketed? Do you think there will be a similar situation in South Africa, where the rand will briefly weaken and then skyrocket strengthen?
Yeah, I don't think we can compare South Africa to the United States for a number of reasons. We can go through those reasons if you want to, but what is likely to happen, I think, if the ANC falls below 50%, I think the financial markets will see that as a positive sign. I think the rand will probably weaken at first because it means change, and the financial markets do not like change. But soon thereafter, depending, of course, what happens, depending on what sort of coalitions will be put together and whether there's going to be a coalition and so on. But depending on that, the rand could either stay weaker, or the financial markets, for that matter, can stay weaker, or it can come back, depending on what happens thereafter. So the initial reaction could be uncertainty, and uncertainty is not good for financial markets. There's something else, however, that's very important and quite positive when you talk about South Africa, and that's the nature of our financial markets. Our financial markets are very, very well regulated, very liquid, and very much integrated with the rest of the world. In fact, our financial markets can be compared to the best in the world. So in practice, quite often, it doesn't really matter who's in charge of government, really, as long as I can buy government bonds and sell it quickly. I don't really care what's going on. And in fact, the worse the government is, the more opportunity there is to get quite a nice yield in the South African financial markets. Come in, take a quick bite out of the apple and run out again, because of the liquidity in the financial markets and the depth of the South African financial markets. So in a perverse kind of way, it is quite possible that even a bad government can actually lead to a temporary strength in things like, for example, the exchange rate of the currency, depending where you start, of course. So if the rand weakens, argument's sake, to say 20 rand to the US dollar, and the bonds weaken to 12% in 2 years' time, that could be a sign for foreigners to come in and say, listen, the currency is overdone, the yields are very juicy, let's see if we can buy a couple of bonds here and pick up a couple of extra points on our investments and so on. So that's quite possible. So even in a bad environment, the financial markets can actually strengthen. But over time, eventually financial markets will return to their underlying fundamentals, and the wrong government, and especially if we have more of the ANC is a wrong government, we don't want their policies, more of the same will happen. And that means a continuation of a weak currency, a continuation of relatively high yields on the bond market because of the risk involved and all that. So the point I want to make is that if we stay on this trajectory, we will have more of the same, and more of the same means weaker growth and everything that goes with it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the short-term prospects will be very uncertain, but long-term, as long as the ANC stays in power, it's not going to.
It could even let's say there's a coalition between the ANC and the EFF, for example. Now, that's not going to be nice. The markets are not going to like that, because not only is it uncertainty, but it's also the move in the wrong direction. But like I've said, in the short term, anything is quite possible. It's quite possible that the markets can rally because of the valuations and so on, and opportunities that foreigners may see in our market. And there are still quite a lot of opportunities. I mean, look at the currency where it is at the moment. it is a weak currency. The bond yields are very, very attractive. And even when things are dull, places falling apart, there are opportunities on South Africa's financial markets. And in fact, I am actually, as a rule, quite bullish on, especially on our bond market. Not necessarily on equities, but the bond market really provides wonderful opportunities, sure, at least in the short term, for somebody like what I've said, to take a quick bite out of that.
Yeah, no, it might be an ANC EFF coalition. It's definitely not going to be an Action SA DA coalition because they don't want to shake each other's hands. Ellen Zille.
Well, who knows? Who knows? Maybe it could. Who knows? It's quite possible. It's quite possible that there could be another kind, a minority kind of coalition. It's possible. If the EFF, and they've done this at the municipality level, where they say, listen, I'm not going to support anybody. And they voted for somebody else as long as the ANC is kept out, kind of thing. And that's quite possible on the national level as well. So don't take it as a given that it's not going to be a DA-led kind of government. It's unlikely, but it's not impossible.
To a certain degree, I was joking that Mashaba and Zille doesn't want to shake hands. But Dawie, okay, these might be stupid questions, but why is the Rand so important in South Africa in terms of political analysis? For example, you always look at the Dow when a political event happens in the United States, but in South Africa, it's the Rand. It's not the JSE that's the most affected. Is that a wrong analysis, or is there something there?
No. I think there's value in that. I think there are three major markets to look at. The first one is the equity market. Everybody knows the equity market is the JSE. And in the case of South Africa, the locally listed companies, they earn more than 60% of their revenue abroad, not even in South Africa. So it doesn't matter what happens in South Africa, their profitability will only be affected to a lesser extent than many other companies listed internationally. So I think that is a very important reason. Another reason has to do with the valuation on the local and international markets. Our equity market is quite cheap, while in many instances, like for example, the US, their equity market is actually quite rich. And when markets are a little bit overvalued, then they tend to be a little bit jittery. And when something happens, they tend to move correct quite quickly. So I think that's perhaps not a very good gauge to measure South Africa's underlying sentiment, so to speak. Another market that you can look at certainly is the Rand, the Forex market. And South Africa's Rand is a very highly traded currency. Of the small countries in the world, it's probably the most liquid currency in the world. And I mentioned that our financial markets are very well regulated and quite liquid. So the currency is all over the place, but the Rand is always an undervalued currency. The question is only how much undervalued. And also keep in mind that we are pretty much price takers when it comes to, for example, the Fed making changes to monetary policy. When they increase interest rates, it's pretty much a given that the Rand is going to weaken because the dollar is going to go up. So, but the point I'm trying to make is that everything in the world is basically somehow measured against the US dollar. And then the third market that I actually think is a much better market to look to analyze and to understand, and that's the bond market in South Africa and abroad. Because the bond market people are not very much aware of the bond market, people don't understand the bond market, or also known as the capital market. I prefer to call it the capital market. And the capital market I think it's the cleverest of all the markets. The capital market includes things like, for example, inflation expectations. It includes things like, for example, interest rates differentials and interest rates expectations. It also includes things like, for example, economic growth and all that. So it's really a complicated market, and the bond market is far better and more forward-looking than any one of these other markets. And the bond market is part of the reason, by the way, why I'm not too concerned about international inflation, because the bond market is telling me that inflation is only temporary internationally. And in the case of South Africa, there are some other factors at play, of course, as well. But the bond market is a place that I would look at if I want to see how the markets are really reacting to things like, for example, a change in policy and a change in government.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I'll definitely check out the bond market more then. But Dawie, if we can pivot to a province that I live in, the Western Cape, there was recently a poll where 46% of Cape Townians say they want a referendum on Cape independence. I don't think I've ever heard you say what's your opinion on this entire scenario of secession. Do you think it's a good idea, or do you think Cape Townians only want to secede because they want to keep the wine for themselves?
I think, and again, I'm not going to give you a straight answer, but let me try to, because I'm an economist. I'm allowed to not give you a straight answer. And I think the answer is really depends. Personally and philosophically, I'm always in favor of people deciding for themselves what they want. See, if the Cape Townians or the Western Cape, if they want to go it alone, let them do it. If KZN, if they want to go alone, let them do it. If Pretoria, for that matter, wants to declare UDI, let them do that. I really don't care. I think people should decide for themselves what they want to do and what not. But as an economist, I think the reality is that there's so much, we're doing so much business with one another. We share so many things. We are so interdependent that it's a completely different story if you want to be completely and totally independent from an economic point of view. So I think the best answer to this is, if I was the Western Cape, I certainly think this idea of more autonomy is a good idea. Independence is perhaps a bit of a strong word, because nobody is really completely and totally independent. So what I think is going to happen to South Africa is the following. I think because of this destructive government that we have, I think things will keep on falling apart. We just saw a report on the railroads, for example, in South Africa, that thing is falling apart. And just about everything else that the ANC touches is falling apart. So the country is falling apart. It's a dangerous place to live in. It's much better to live in the Western Cape. And there are many reports. The Auditor General report, I think, is a very good one. So yes, if I was the Western Cape, I would say, listen, and also very importantly, is that the Western Cape is a surplus province and Gauteng is a surplus province, but all the other provinces are deficit provinces. What I mean by that is that the Western Cape and Gauteng contribute more to the central finances and get less out of it. So from a financial point of view, it will be to their benefit if they can somehow get that extra taxes and spend it in the Western Cape only. But how to do that? Well, in an environment where things are falling apart, I think certainly you would want to have more autonomy. You want to have a bite out of the cake, bigger chunk out of the cake that you are contributing to. That makes sense to me. But I don't think the right approach will be a hostile approach. I don't think it should be a matter of the Western Cape and say, listen, we're going to go it alone and you do, and we're going to do it, and it doesn't matter what you say, sort of thing. I think what they need to do, there are two approaches. Either try to negotiate more say in your own affairs, but stay in a federation kind of thing in South Africa. That's one possibility. Or the other possibility will be that not do anything because the country is falling apart anyway, and just be a good government. That's all. Just be a good government in the Western Cape, and you will, for all practical purposes, become a semi-autonomous region in South Africa. But if you really want to go for full independence, which will include a different currency, which will include different financial markets, which will include various bourses and things like, and a new tax system and all that, and new electricity network and all that. I don't think it's a good idea. It's always a good idea rather to work with your neighbors and try to have a say over your own affairs, but only as far as you don't step on too many toes around you. I think that's the best approach. To do it in a hostile manner certainly is not the right way to do it, but to try to become more autonomous and have a little bit more say over your own affairs in a friendly manner, I think that's the right approach.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of people in the Western Cape would agree with you. The problem is, I think why people are turning towards independence is because the national government is so reluctant to devolve powers. I mean, there was just a recent case where Bekele was asked to devolve the powers of police to the Western Cape, and he said, not only are we not going to do that, we're going to take more powers away from you. There's a sort of an arrogance.
Yeah, I agree with you. But you know what happens in practice is that we have, the police is a good example. We have, for all practical purposes, privatized the police because there are more private security officials out there than policemen. So it doesn't matter what he says. You just ignore that and you do your own thing. So that's a very good example of don't say anything, don't even oppose the minister, simply do your own thing. because the government is just not there. The national government is just not doing what it's supposed to be. Just do your own thing. That's it. Ignore them.
Yeah, I definitely want to turn to digital countries, which I know people like you and Professor Koos Milan, he refers to micro-republics. So I definitely want to ask you about that. But first, in our first interview we did with you, you said that the Western Cape shouldn't bother with a referendum, just declare independence. What did you mean by that? How would you do something?
No, not really declare independence because what does it mean to declare independence? It means that I'm a completely different country now, and I have my own police force, and I have my own army, and I have my own borders, and I have. That's just not going to work for them, and it's not going to work for the rest of South Africa either. Simply what you need to do is just do a good job. That's all, and you will become de facto independent without causing damage to things like, for example, existing trade between the Western Cape and the rest of South Africa, for instance.
Okay, fair enough. So, Dawie, I try to sell this idea because I love the idea of digital countries, and I try to sell it to my friends and family members. And then they ask me, but Donald, who's going to fill the potholes? Who's going to provide security if you have a digital country? Because I can imagine you can do the court system and the legal system online. You can do the political stuff online because all of that stuff is done over Zoom anyway at this moment. But how do you handle the nitty-gritty day-to-day stuff if you have a digital country?
Yeah, the reality is that we are physical beings. We still have to eat, and we still have to live somewhere, and we have to drive somewhere, and so on. But maybe let's just take a step back and just look at the bigger numbers. And the bigger numbers simply is that most economies in the world is that the tertiary sector, which include things like services, or let's call it the digitizable economy, if you like, that is by far the biggest chunk of their economies, and that's a part that's growing fastest as well, including in South Africa. The primary sectors, which are mostly, let's call it physical sectors, things like, for example, mining and agriculture, that needs to happen at a physical place, in a mine or on a farm. But even there, you see a lot of those activities are moving to the service industry. A good example, but I always like to use is like, for example, genetic engineering. Genetic engineering, if you compare that to somebody 10,000 years ago, the best comparison then would be a farmer. So a geneticist today is the equivalent of a farmer 1,000 years ago, or even 100 years ago. But that doesn't happen on a farm. That happens in a lab, or it happens at the university, for example. So the overlap is getting bigger and bigger, and it's growing more in the service kind of, or like I've said, the digitizable kind of economy. But you're right, we are still physical beings, and we need to fill the pothole somewhere, albeit less so. We're still less dependent on physical things because we're moving around less. I mean, I'm sitting in my office at home at the moment, and I don't care if there's a pothole, or I care less if there's a pothole in the street outside my where I stay, simply because I drive less. But still, somebody needs to fill that. And in practice, what happens, and I use myself as an example. I live in a state like many South Africans today. Our electricity came on this morning at 2 o'clock. It was out for 10 days, without electricity. We've got a solar system, and we're pretty much sorted. It was a little bit inconvenient, but we're pretty much sorted. We've got boreholes. We've got our own security. We organized for more security guards. And the pothole in the municipality road is still there, granted, but for most of the other things, we are looking after ourselves. And I think, and that's what I agree with Professor Malan on these micro-republics, because I live in one of those, and more people will be living in these micro-republics. And not only that, we will also work more in these micro-republics. A good example is we will start joining these digital communities. And most of us already belong to these digital communities. Facebook is a good example. WhatsApp groups, annoying WhatsApp groups I can add to that, are examples of digital societies, digital countries, if you like. And it doesn't matter where you live, really. But yes, you're absolutely right. There is a physical aspect to this. We need to eat and all that. And that, I think, is one of the major challenges living in South Africa. And that is to be physically safe. That is the first thing that you have to make sure of if you live in South Africa, because it's a dangerous place. Be physically safe. Thereafter, You have to look at things like, for example, have a proper internet connection, the necessary hardware and the necessary skills and so on. And then it doesn't really matter where you live. You can live anywhere in the world. As long as you're safe and you've got the proper connection and you've got the skills, then you can be part of any community in the world. And so in a way, we're returning to city-states of 500-600 years ago. The only difference is that these city-states are not physical, with big walls around them, although some of them do have that. But many of these city-states are digital in a way, somewhere up there in the cloud. Now, all we need, Donald, all we need is some of these private currencies to become more acceptable. Then we can really declare full independence.
Yeah, definitely. Did you say 10 days without electricity? That's incredible. And in Gauteng?
Yeah, it's one specific area where we live. Apparently one of the substations burned down. But the funny thing is this substation has been burning down a number of times since we stayed here. So what I can't get my head around is, why don't they fix it once and for all and fix this burning down issue? So I don't understand it. And while they were fixing it, the cables got stolen.
Wow.
So what a nightmare. I mean, what a complete nightmare. What happens now is that I can see this morning, people are getting people out to come and give them quotes for solar systems. So in a month's time, Eskom will sell even less electricity in this area because they failed us, Eskom and the local municipality. So we're just not going to make use of them anymore. We're going to look after ourselves because we cannot trust them. You cannot have a deep freeze full of meat or other perishable things because it's going to get bad and it's going to cost us money. You can't have a business because you don't have electricity. Now we make sure we have electricity, and in the end, it's going to be the local authorities going to be the big losers because I'm simply not going to buy electricity from them anymore because I can't trust them.
Yeah, no, it's incredible that they can just let your power go out for 10 days and just, oops. But so can one make an argument that an organization like Afriforum and a private security company like Thornburn can create a digital country today? I mean, aren't they essentially doing that at this very moment? Like Afriforum is filling potholes, Thornburn is providing security. They just group up, but you divert your taxes to them, and there you have your digital country.
Yeah, and something, if you look at the functions of the state, there are a couple of so-called primary functions of the state. The first one is law and order and defense. So those are, because the nature of a state, the way that we understand a state today, and I use the word state and not government because those are two different things, but the essence of a state is that it is an entity that monopolizes violence, basically. That is what a state is. So defense and law and order must be one of the primary functions of the state. Then from there on, there could be some other functions for the state as well, like, for example, infrastructure and maybe things like, for example, education and health services and so on. But primarily, the state is responsible for safety, primarily. But there's another function of the state, and that is to provide an independent legal system, the judiciary. That is also usually seen as one of the primary functions of the state, and that is to provide the judiciary. But what is interesting is that more and more the private sector in South Africa is making use of the private judiciary. Now, there's an organization called Sakeliga, and they've just launched something, they call it private dispute resolution system that they implement, which simply means that if you and I belong to them, and I don't even know whether you need to be a member or not, I'm not sure, but they can actually provide senior advocates or retired judges or whatever to hear your case, totally and completely private, and it's much, much cheaper, much, much more efficient, and they can make a ruling on two individuals that's got some sort of dispute, some kind of thing. Now, there's an example where the private sector is taking over even one of the primary functions of the state, namely the judiciary. So imagine in future, you and I, we belong to this organization, we enter into a contract, I'm going to buy your car for A, B, and C for 10,000 Rand or whatever, and we agree that this private legal system, we will make use of that if there's some sort of dispute, and suddenly I find out you've put banana peels into the gearbox of the car, and then because of the agreement between you and I, We go to this private dispute resolution way, and it's much cheaper, much quicker, and we get an outcome much sooner. So that can be done. So it's not only a matter of closing up the potholes, but it's also literally taking over some of the other primary functions of the state that is already happening in South Africa. And that's making South Africa such an exciting place to live. Because like I've said, and we've already privatized the police. It doesn't matter what Sally thinks, but we've privatized the police. We're busy privatizing the judiciary. Education in South Africa, to a very large extent, has been privatized because of the inferior quality of our education in South Africa. And the lockdown, by the way, accelerated many of these trends that were very well established beforehand already. So there are so many things that are happening that the private sector is taking over that pretty soon the politicians will find out, but we're simply ignoring them because we don't need them anymore. And you can't, another primary function of the state is defense. That means that you have to have an army if you want to be a state. But South African Defence Force is in such a mess. We don't have a real defence force. I mean, they can't do anything. So I don't really know why we still have them, because many of these functions, really, thinking about that, well, what is there that I voluntarily want to buy from the state? And I can't think of anything. I mean, my kids go to a private school. I go to private medical facilities. I make use of private dispute resolution. I've got my own private security system here. I've got my own electricity. I've got my own water. I've got everything. Why do I need the state? And why should I keep on paying taxes if I don't need them?
Yeah. Now you're paying taxes so that you can hear Ramaphosa speak every week over COVID. But Dawie, how does a retired, I mean, that sounds great, but how does a retired judge have any legitimacy? So how can he make a ruling? He's retired.
No, you can. No, certainly you can. If you and I enter into a totally legal contract, and you and I decide that if there's some sort of dispute between you and I, then we will abide by whatever anybody says. So if we decide that your mother will be a good person to go to if there's a dispute between you and I, because that is a valid contract.
So you just have to stipulate in the contract, this retired judge or a lawyer, you will decide the case. In fact, we've been using it at the Efficient Group. We've been doing that for many, many years, for literally 20 years already. So it can be done. It's a normal. It's much cheaper. I mean, you can all you have to do is listen. People tend to do this. Is to listen. We will decide to make use of a retired advocate, for example, if there's some sort of dispute between you and I. So no, it's completely and totally legal. That's interesting. Dawie, so you earlier mentioned private currencies. I recently watched a very interesting interview on Bitcoin, and the doctor that was being interviewed, he made a very fascinating point that Bitcoin, all the cryptocurrencies have basically been replicas of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is just something unique. The founder of Bitcoin, he did something nobody really understands. He disappeared, and all the other private currencies were just replicas. Is there something just unique with Bitcoin that people struggle to imitate Bitcoin?
And remember, I'm not a technical guy, so don't ask me the technical stuff here. But basically, what makes Bitcoin so unique, and all these other private, most of them of these private currencies are trying to copy exactly that, is that when you want to have, in a current financial system in which we operate, if you want to have certainty about something, you must have some sort of champion to which you can appeal if something goes wrong. A good example is, my bank stole my money, and now I'm going to go to the champion, and the champion is the South African Reserve Bank. Because the South African Reserve Bank is the center of the universe when it comes to financial matters in South Africa. So that's a good example of somebody, the big policeman looking after everybody else. But what Bitcoin makes is different, because we do not have a champion looking after everybody else. We do not have a center of the universe. We are all part of this universe, and everything is decentralized. But it's decentralized in such a manner that you cannot lie, because everybody needs to confirm that a certain transaction has, not everybody, but the majority of computers in this network called the blockchain need to confirm that a certain transaction actually did happen. And you don't need a champion, and you don't need a centralized organization to confirm that the transaction happened, because the decisions are decentralized, but it is still information that can be trusted. So we trust the Rand because we believe that the Reserve Bank will step in if there's some sort of dispute between me and a bank or whatever, between banks or whatever the case might be, and the Reserve Bank will make a decision and a call. We trust the Reserve Bank for doing that. But making use of the blockchain system, there's no individual or no organization to go to, because the blockchain is that organization. But the nature of the technology is such that you can actually trust this information. So a very good example of a so-called smart contract is that the information that you are the owner of the car with the banana peels and the gearbox, and now we enter into an agreement between you and I buy this car with the banana peels and the gearbox from you for 10,000 Rand in return, and now the ownership moves to me, and I become the new owner of this car with the banana peels and all, and everybody is witnessing this transaction, and therefore you cannot sell it to somebody else, because everybody knows that ownership now vests with me. So yeah, I think that's the big difference, is that you don't have a central authority that can guarantee all sort of things. It is the system that guarantees information, and that's why I prefer to call. There's a certain definition that economists will use when you talk about money, but I think that we need to change that definition of money, and we need to include the word information in whatever new definition of money we decide upon. The definition of money today is anything that is generally accepted as money. It doesn't say much, but that's the official definition as money. So if we accept things for money, then it is money. But I think what we can change that to say any information that is generally accepted as money is also money. So I think the word information needs to be included in the definition of money.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, okay, so we know the advantages of pegging a private currency to a host of other currencies. It will be more stable. But why would you not want to do that? So, for example, why is Bitcoin not pegged to other currencies? Why would you just go it alone and just trust whatever the value is Bitcoin as at the moment?
You can do that. By the way, the South African Rand is not pegged to anything. There's no gold. The dollar is not pegged to anything. We don't have a gold standard anymore. There are some currencies that are pegged, like, for example, the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar. So that's an example of it's called the so-called currency board. So there are examples. And in the past, at the time of the gold standard, most currencies were pegged to one another in one way or the other. And before the euro, most European currencies were pegged at a certain exchange rate to one another. So there are many examples where currencies are pegged to one another. But in the modern world, most currencies are free floating. They'll go up and down depending on factors like interest rates and inflation and things like that. And Bitcoin can be compared to one of these normal currencies as well. There's nothing underneath it. There's nothing supporting it. There's no gold standard for Bitcoin either. But you can, if you want to, you can introduce a currency. And in fact, we at Efficient Group, we're in the process of doing exactly that. We have issued a currency on the blockchain, a coin. And the underlying asset of this coin is actually a listed financial instrument on the JSE. So you give me money and I give you a coin in return, and I take the money to buy something on the JSE. So you can buy and sell these coins on the blockchain as much as you like and bring it back to me one day, and I will sell the underlying asset and give you the money back again, the Rand money back again. Or I can simply sell you a coin and take your money and keep it somewhere in a safe and say, listen, one day when you bring me your coin back, I'll give you the cash back again. And you're right. That will lead to more stability. But unfortunately, even if I peg it to the South African Rand, the Rand itself is quite a volatile currency. So you're not going to you're not going to get rid of instability or volatility completely, because the things that you link it to will be volatile as well. I think if you want to have more stability in a currency, one of these private currencies, or it doesn't matter what, the best way to get stability is to create more liquidity or more depth in your financial markets. And what I mean by that is that allow more derivatives to be created on your currency, and get more people involved and get more people to participate in this and with this currency. And more people means more stability, at least theoretically, not always, but at least theoretically. And I think that is gradually happening to Bitcoin as well. Bitcoin is still very, very volatile, but as it becomes more, if people start using it more, and if people write more derivatives on Bitcoin, then gradually I think Bitcoin will gradually get slightly more stable as a currency over time.
Yeah, I'm talking perhaps on the heavy correction, but I believe Bitcoin is one of the most used currencies at the moment.
Depending on what you mean by use, for transaction purposes, certainly not. Okay. Because that's a downside. And again, I'm not a technical person here, so don't take my word for that. But it is quite expensive to buy bread with Bitcoin. So typically, what one can do, what I think is going to happen in future, I think some of these private currencies will specialize in certain functions. Bitcoin, for instance, may become a preferred store of value. So I put my savings in Bitcoin, and if I want to buy bread, I take a small piece of my Bitcoin and I put it in another private currency that is much cheaper to transact with, and I can use that to buy bread and normal stuff, and use Bitcoin only as a store of value, or mostly as a store of value. So I think in future what we're going to see is that many of these currencies will start specializing in these various kinds of things. I did mention that I think we should include the word information in whatever definition we use for money. But keep in mind that information can also change. We talked about the so-called smart contract. Say, for instance, we put a contract on the blockchain, and in this contract we say, I'm going to buy your car, you are the owner, and in return for your car, I'm going to get 10,000 rands worth of Bitcoin from you, which is already in your wallet. And at a certain future date, this transaction will be concluded. Then neither you nor I can make any changes to this contraction. It's part of the blockchain. It will happen. And on that specific future date, ownership of the car will move to me, and the ownership of my piece of Bitcoin will move to you, and nobody can turn it around. And that's the part of the wonder of so the nature of this information changed. Initially, it was a contract between you and I, and then you were the owner of the car, I was the owner of a piece of Bitcoin, and now ownership of these two things changed. I'm the owner of the car now, and suddenly you got money in return. So that the nature of the information changed from, in your case, from being the owner of the car to eventually becoming the owner of a piece of Bitcoin. And you can do, there are many derivatives that can be structured in similar kind of ways, and where the nature of this information can change. So it was only a contract, and now it turns into money, for example.
Yeah, it's very interesting. But yeah, I see our time is running out. Dawie, one last question I want to ask you, because you did an interview with Uli Koorts. He's an economist from the United States, and you mentioned to him at the end of that interview that there might be a lot of hidden economic growth. And I know also you did a lecture on that. There might be a lot of hidden economic growth, and the traditional economic statistics is not picking that up. But he mentioned to you that if that were true, you would see more velocity, more volume. I don't know precisely the economist word. There would be more, velocity or.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, just answer.
Okay. Can I explain something very? Can I allow me, if I may,
sure,
to explain money a little bit, and then I think it will put it in the context. Say, for example, you've got a small island. On one side is person A, and the other side is person B. And every day, person A can produce an apple, or person B can produce a pear. And we put 10 rand into the system. So what happens is that we give person A the 10 rand. And now this person, he will walk the whole day to get to the other side of the island and give person B the 10 rand and buy the pear and walk the whole night back to the other side of the island. The day thereafter, person B will walk all the way to the other side of the island, buy an apple, and walk all the way back to the other side of the island. This is the economy. So this economy will produce one apple one day and one pear the next day. Okay. Now we're going to make some changes to this economy. Say we put 20 rand into the system. So tomorrow morning, person A wakes up and he sees that he's got 20 rand, so not 10 rand anymore. Now he can walk over all the way to person B. Now he's got 20 rand. Now one or two things can happen. Either you're going to buy a pair, 2 pairs for 10 rand each, or the price of that pair is going to go up. So it will be 20 rand for one pair. We call it inflation. Okay, that's an example. So that's one possibility that could happen. Or there could be an increase in production or something in between. But there's another thing that we can do. What we can do, we can give the next morning when person A wakes up, there's a bicycle. So it doesn't take him the whole day to walk to the other side. It takes him half a day to go to the other side of the island and then leave and half a day to come back again. And that is what is meant by velocity of money. How quickly money is turned around in that economy. And that was Uli's argument. He says if there's more economic activity, then we will see an increase in velocity. And he is absolutely correct on that. But, and there's always a bit of a but to this. And let me tell you what I mean by this but. The other day I went out to Cape Town, and I asked the person that organizes my life. I asked her she asked me whether she should get a car for me. And I said, no, I'm going to make use of Uber. And that started me thinking. So if I asked her to get a car for me, a rental, then she would need to fill in a form. She needs to send it to somebody that has to approve this form. Then I have to send it to somebody that needs to make the necessary payment to the car people. And of course, that will become part of our whole financial bookkeeping and whatever in our company. The car people will receive the payment. They have to check the payment. They have to receive this request for the car. Then they will send it to the car fixing people that need to wash the car, make sure there's a spare wheel, and make sure there are no dents and the car is filled up and all that. And a lot of stuff happened. Then I will rock up there and I will fill in papers and go and check the car for the spare wheel and the jack and all that and see it's full and have a bit of a fight because I stand in a queue and all that. And eventually I will go to my meeting and I have to drive around the block a couple of times because I can't find parking. And eventually when I go in, I go and see the person I need to see. I'm probably going to be late and I can't have a drink because I have to drive after the meeting again, and I might end up in jail. So that's sort of thing what will usually happen. What I instead did, I called Uber when we landed. We got into Uber, went to the place we wanted to go to, much quicker, without any bothering of anything, or all these things that I've just mentioned. So where is that captured? And the answer is, actually what happened, there were fewer economic activities taking place. So the economy was actually smaller, but the outcome was the same. The outcome is me going to a meeting. That's the outcome. It's still the same, but with far, far, far less input. And the answer is there were fewer economic activities. The economy, in this small example, actually contracted, which isn't the case because the purpose of all of this was for me to go to a meeting. Now, there's one of the examples. So the turnover, the velocity of money in this example actually slowed down and quite significantly so. But I still achieved my objective, and that is to go to a meeting somewhere and have a drink.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, okay, if I understood you correctly, what you're saying is that essentially you just get more time. The economy contracts, but you get more time and to do something else if you want to do something else.
In fact, I use that time to work, to do some other stuff. So instead of standing in a queue, filling in forms or whatever, I use that time to do some other stuff. And the same person that would have organized my car, they use that time to do some other stuff. And now that means I have to employ fewer people, but my turnover stays the same in the company or maybe even better. But the cost of running, of generating this profit is actually significantly less now. So I make more money for the company and for the shareholders. And it's not captured, and it's not properly captured in economic data.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay, but yeah, Dawie, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your expert analysis. I want to, if you have any last words, by all means, take you. Okay.
All I can say, it's always a privilege to talk to you and to discuss economics. And so thank you very much.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Dawie, and for helping me also to understand it, because yeah, it's definitely not precisely my field. And to our viewers, if you've made it this far, please consider liking this video. You've obviously enjoyed this content, so please consider liking this video, subscribing, and donating on Patreon. My name is Donald, and you've been watching WorldView.